The sun over the village of Umudike was not merely a source of light. It was a relentless, unblinking eye of fire that stared down at the parched earth without a hint of mercy or reprieve. In this ancient corner of the world, the soil was a deep, vibrant red, a color the elders whispered was the dried blood of the ancestors who had fought to claim this land centuries ago. For most men in the village, this red earth was a generous and fertile mother. Nadi, the village blacksmith, possessed a small, rocky plot tucked away near the stream that somehow managed to overflow with cassava every single season, no matter how sparse the rains were. Mazi Obi, a man so old his skin resembled the bark of a baobab and who walked with a crooked mahogany stick, consistently produced yams as thick as a grown man's thigh. But for Okeke, the land was not a mother, it was a stubborn, silent enemy that refused to yield even a handful of edible grain. Okeke was by no means a lazy man. In the social fabric of Umudike, laziness was a sin second only to theft, and Okeke was determined to be seen as a pillar of industry. He was often the very first person to arrive at his fields in the morning, long before the silver mist of the dawn had been chased away by the rising heat. He was also consistently the last to leave, often seen working by the dim, flickering light of a palm oil lamp well after the moon had taken its place in the sky. He owned the largest stretch of territory in the entire valley, a sprawling expanse of land that his father, Ude, had left him as a legacy of hope. It was a kingdom of potential that should have fed half the village and earned Okeke the double-beaded anklet of an Ozo-titled man, a position of immense prestige and power. Instead, his farm was a graveyard of ambition. Every morning, Okeke would stand at the edge of his property, his hands resting heavily on his hips and his brow frowned in a permanent mask of frustration. He would stare at the stunted, sickly yellowish stalks of maize that struggled to reach even his knees, looking like skeletal fingers reaching out of the dirt. While his neighbors' farms whistled and sang with the lush, rhythmic sound of wind blowing through thick, healthy leaves, Okeke's farm was eerily silent. The only sounds to be heard were the dry, brittle rustle of dying weeds and the occasional mocking cackle of a vulture perched on a nearby dead branch. He felt as though the very spirits of the air were laughing at his misfortune. "Why has the earth turned its back on me?" he would often shout into the empty air, his voice raspy from the fine red dust that seems to coat his throat and lungs. "I have followed every tradition passed down by the fathers of our fathers. I cleared the brush before the first moon of the planting season appeared. I burned the debris with such meticulous care that not a single sprout of green was harmed by the flames. I planted the yams at the perfect depth, measuring the coolness of the soil with my own bare fingers. Yet the earth treats my sweat like it is bitter poison, and the rain clouds seem to skip over my ridges as if they are afraid of what lies beneath my soil. Am I a cursed man in a blessed land?" The psychological toll of this constant failure was far heavier than the physical labor of tilling the stubborn ground. In Umudike, a man's worth was not measured by the speed of his feet or the strength of his wrestling grip. A man was measured by the size and fullness of his yam barn. A man with an empty barn was a man without a voice in the village square. When the elders gathered under the great ancestral tree to discuss the affairs of the community, be it land disputes or marriage dowries, Okeke was forced to sit in the very back, his head bowed. He could feel the eyes of the other men boring into his back, some eyes filled with a soft, unbearable pity that made him want to scream, while others held a subtle, stinging contempt. They whispered in the marketplace that perhaps his heart was not pure, or that he had inherited a secret curse from an ancestor who had offended the forest spirits. His wife, Ma, tried her best to be a source of strength, but the relentless grind of poverty had etched deep, weary lines into her once radiant face. They had 3 children to feed, and every evening the family meal was a desperate exercise in subtraction. "We must stretch the remaining flour today," she would say, her eyes carefully avoiding his as she stirred a thin pot of soup. "If we eat until our bellies are full tonight, we will have nothing but boiled water for the next 3 nights." Okeke would only nod in silence, the shame burning in his chest hotter than the midday sun. He was a big man with a big farm, but he was failing the simplest, most ancient duty of a provider. This cycle of public failure and private hunger had turned his heart into a dry, hollow husk. He was a man pushed to the edge, and on the edge, men often look for help in places they should avoid.